Now, some of you know me for my chief skill, which is doing the washing up. And I do enjoy doing that. I'm okay on serving the food, although like a lot of us, I find on Fridays the smell of the sausages is almost unbearable, but we do it, don't we, the breakfast thing. And it is great fun, and I have loved being part of the St. Patrick's team. So all of you who only know me from early in the morning and washing up and so on, hi, and isn't it good to be here in a slightly more civilized way? I hope I'm able to give some useful insights into this question of male and female, which, whether we like it or not, and I do quite like it because it's quite fun, is a major issue today. When you meet people and they want to talk about the Catholic faith, it would be so nice if they would say, in a very sort of profound way, tell me what you believe about the Blessed Sacrament. Because you think, I can do that, yay, and you've got the stuff and you've read the booklet, but they don't. They say something like, why is your church anti the gays? Or why can't women be priests? Not always in a way that invites a response, because they think they've already got the answer, but in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable and slightly complicated and unhappy. One of the lessons in life is that you are never really called on to defend the most important and beautiful truths of the Christian faith in a time and place and manner of your choosing. It will always be something awkward. And we know this from history. If you were standing in the Colosseum and the lions are about to be unleashed, and people are shouting at you that you're being disloyal to the emperor, it's not a very good place to start explaining the difference between your loyalty to Rome and your belief in Almighty God and the Son of God. Do you see what I mean? You just go for the martyrdom and just make the sign of the cross and say, I'm with Christ, or as long as you have to blurt out whatever the quick words are. So that's the place where we'll start, which is probably a place we'd rather not be. Are you with me? We're discussing something that I actually find very interesting, I think you will too, but which may not be your choice of topic when people ask you why you go to church, why you are a Catholic, what you believe. Do you see what I mean? It would be much nicer if people could ask a gentler question in a nicer way in ideal circumstances. But life being what it is, they don't. They speak particularly about the issues of today, and they often speak in a rather cross and aggressive tone. As do I, when I'm riled. I remember once hearing a recording of me on the radio, and I sounded absolutely awful. All that you could hear was this crabbic, cross woman saying, that's not true, no, that's stupid. Oh, it doesn't help. I'm all right when it's milder, although I have to say one of the more memorable things that one of my young relatives said. Years ago, we were all gathering at my mother's house, and as we were chatting later, little Monica said, we saw you coming up the drive, and Daddy said, here comes your Auntie Joanna, children, brace yourselves. I've never forgotten that. It's the sort of reputation one has within the family. So we are going to discuss a topic that is not necessarily one we would all choose when we wish to express the deepest convictions of our Christian faith, but it is one that's the topic today, and we may not always find it easy to do it in the way we would like. Nevertheless, we're going to do it, and I have found it very profoundly interesting. Male and female, are we different? Does it matter? And what is the place that this has in God's plan? Male and female, he created them. When we hear these words, they're so familiar to us that we gloss over it. Oh yes, nice bit of the Bible, you know, male and female, he created them, yum. But actually, it's a profound truth from the beginning. It's very interesting, the Bible speaks about the beginning, and it does so, as you will know, at the beginning of the Old Covenant and the beginning of the New. In the beginning was the Word, St. John's Gospel says, the beginning. And from the beginning, there was male and female. Now, it's true that today this is denied. The idea is we are all, as the fashionable expression puts it, on a spectrum. We are all a little bit male and a little bit female. Now, this is not true. You want somebody who will give you a lecture on biology to go into greater detail on this, but we must start by saying that as an absolute and general statement that there are males and females. You can go into the XX and XY chromosome, you can look at lots of things, and you can discuss quite a lot around this topic. There are also unknowns about quite a lot of our physiology and how we are made. And there is a debate about why we are made, which we can answer as Christians. But it does matter to us that we are male and female, and it does matter that this is grounded in a biological reality. That doesn't mean, as I've said, that it's an absolutely simplistic thing. It's also true that people can make mistakes because they're fashionable mistakes. You can quite often get a lot of people sincerely believing something that they know is not really true, but which they think sheds some light on life and our experience. And you can also get people believing very sincerely something that is absolutely untrue. We all know about the snake oil salesman who will tell you that this oil will make you well or something. But it's also true that you can have something which is not an entirely quack medicine, which may have something in it. I can remember as a teenager that teenage girls' magazines, it was very fashionable then in the 70s, to say that if you put vinegar in the rinsing water of when you washed your hair, it was before we all had fancy shower heads, you washed in a basin. If you put vinegar, it would make your hair glossy, unless you were blonde, in which case it should be lemon juice. I don't think there was any truth in that at all. But it sort of felt it ought to be true. Do you know what I mean? What with vinegar being tangy. Does that make sense? And lemon being sort of bleachy? I don't think there's any evidence it was true at all. And there was certainly no evidence in the other one, which is break an egg into the shampoo, pour some into a bowl, and it will nourish your hair. Hair is dead. You know, the egg can't, you know, the protein can't. Do you see what I'm saying? And yet, it is in general terms true that if you put various things on your hair, it might make it glossier or whatever, and if you don't wash it, it'll get dank and sticky. And do you see where I'm going with that? And for example, lavender, the very name tells you it comes from the Latin, lavabo, I would wash, and it gives us words like laundry, and has for centuries been used to make soap. So when somebody tells you lavender soap is particular, well, there's something in that. Do you see where I'm going with this? To denounce all use of herbs or natural medicines on the basis that Joanna Bogle once said she didn't think vinegar did your hair any good would be silly. And there is some evidence that if you put, not lavender, but for example, rosemary in water, then that will be quite cleaning, and it helps to clean your scalp, but probably not as effectively as shampoo. I'm only saying, don't assume that when I say male and female are two separate things, that means that we should denounce every single thing about the way the two sexes interact. Nevertheless, let's understand, is there a significance in being born male and female? And the Catholic answer is yes, and it's there in the scriptures from the beginning. When God, Almighty God, took human flesh and became incarnate, he became incarnate as a man. In the natural order of things in human biology, a man can generate life outside of himself, and a woman cannot. There is a very deep understanding going all the way through the Old Covenant and through the New and to now and right now in the Church of the significance of male and female. In the Old Covenant, you have Almighty God and the chosen people of Israel. And the interaction is always seen as nuptial, spousal. In the New Covenant, Christ speaks of his bride, feminine, the church. And this is a nuptial union, and you and I and all the baptized are children of that union. There is always a giving on the part of God and a receiving on the part of his people in the Old Covenant and in the New. This is very important. This idea of God as Father and as generating life and as nuptial. This idea that Almighty God then became incarnate as a man is very important. Now, this is often denied. And there's a way in which people say today, and have said in the past, no, our bodies don't really matter. What matters is your spirit. This is a very old heresy, sometimes known as Gnosticism. sometimes known as angelism. And it was a very popular heresy at one point in the early Middle Ages. Your spirit matters, but your body is merely an encumbrance. It's something that gets between you and God. It shouldn't really be there. What matters is your spirit. One group of people who were very keen on this were the Cathars. Have you heard about them? Yes, well, if you go to the part of France where they live, they're now frightfully popular. It's a tourist thing. Come to Cathar territory. And the word comes from the word for purity. The name Catherine comes from the word pure. Their idea of purity, however, was that your body is wrong. You shouldn't have it. You should have just the soul. Well, because of this, it was felt that suicide was beautiful because you get rid of the body. Starving yourself was beautiful. And having babies was wrong because it makes, if you like, more bodies. A complete mess. And the interesting thing about this is that it was a heresy that took quite a lot of stamping out. The Church's way of stamping out heresy has not always been the best way. One favoured way of doing it was to burn alive somebody they decide was a heretic. This has been proved over the centuries to be wrong and, to put it mildly, not helpful. Although I'm told that people enjoyed it, nothing like a good burning, bring the children, packed of sandwiches, yummy, yummy. And unfortunately, there is some evidence that people did like this. On a technicality, it was the Church sort of handing you over to the state because you were seen as a danger to the state. But it was not a good policy and did the Church much harm. And very beautifully, Saint, as he now is, thank God, he's one of my great heroes, Saint John Paul, memorably at the turn of the millennium, spoke very deeply and humbly in an apology to God for methods not in keeping with the gospel. You can almost hear Almighty God saying, you can say that again. It got rid of the heretic, but it didn't get rid of the heresy. Because what you really have to do when there's a heresy is raise up saints who say yes to God, who then preach and teach and live and teach again, and if necessary, face martyrdom to bring the truth. So, Catharism, angelism was all wrong. Our bodies are very important. Male and female, he created them. Our bodies are sacred. They are temples of our souls. And they're not just the outward trimmings. And God, in a mysterious way, requires us to have bodies in order that he can fill heaven with our souls. He embodied us, and he embodied himself. He became human. He became a man. And it wasn't an accident. He was a man, born of a woman. This understanding of a man and a spousal relationship with his church, it's very, very important. And this real flesh, not flesh in general, but male flesh, is very, very important in the life of the church. This is my body, Christ said at the Last Supper. This is my blood. We do need to understand that for the people of his day, that idea, consuming somebody's blood, was disgusting. And in fact, there's a Middle Eastern expression to this day that translates as something like, he eats my flesh, of somebody who frightens you. So the idea that you would be invited in this very bodily way, and this maleness and femaleness has been echoed all of the way through. For Almighty God, in his plan, it was always spousal from the beginning. There was always a giving and a receiving. The church is the bride. She receives the truth from Christ. I'm going to go into this in a little bit more detail because it's very important. Somebody said to me, oh, but that's awful. That means the woman is always just the receiver. And we're speaking here of sacred and important and precious things. Every married lady knows that to receive is not to be passive. To receive is not to be passive. And the idea of the giving and receiving in matrimony is very important. And this goes all the way through, at a very profound spiritual level, the story of our redemption. Words are also important because we communicate. Our vocal cords, we use our bodies to communicate. And Christ spoke, and you are listening to me with your ears. Our bodies are the way we teach the faith, and they are also central to the essence of being spousal. At a wedding, the man and woman exchange vows, and they have to be heard. You will know that the wedding is not valid unless witnesses hear this exchange of vows, freely given, freely received. And they both have to make it clear that they know what they're doing and the vows are identical. I take you, I take you. You know, it's a total giving and receiving. To be my lawful wedded wife, to be my lawful wedded husband. It's a male and a female. It's verbal. And in a very important sense, the word is then made flesh. And 9 months later may come to dwell among us. This is important. This is spousal. And you need to understand that for Christians this is sacred, and the Mass is also nuptial. The priest says words, and on the altar the word is made flesh and dwells amongst us. And he does this as a nuptial bond with the church. Now, Christians have always known this, but it's only really been developed in more recent times precisely because the idea that male and female are identical and interchangeable has been pushed about. And it was John Paul II who, for me at least, opened up the idea of this being a nuptial thing, the nuptial meaning of the Eucharist. I remember thinking, I don't really get that. And there are two choices you have when you don't get something, either to study it more or to say it must be wrong because I don't get it. And after some resistance, I eventually decided I would find out more. There is something very deep here, and that dialogue and its use of human words is something very interesting. In a mysterious sense, the dialogue between priest and people is crucial to the Mass. Dominus vobiscum, says the priest, the Lord be with you. And we respond, et cum spiritu tuo, and with thy spirit. And it's interesting because the spirit in the priest is subtly different because he is a priest, he's been ordained. But in a mysterious sense, that dialogue is important. It's actually why, if you go to a Mass where you make the response, you understand it a bit more richly. Having it said in a very low murmur by an altar server is to me very inadequate. It's technically possible, but it's not as rich somehow as that dialogue. Priest and people, bridegroom and bride, Christ and his church. There's a very important sense in which when the priest says, this is my body, it's a male voice speaking about the male Christ. When we look at this, we understand too the dialogue, very important, between Mary and the angel. It was a real dialogue. It wasn't a spiritual thing that Mary felt. She heard with her ears a voice. She really heard it, so much so that we heard that she was startled. She had to be told not to be afraid and so on. Very interesting. She responded, you will have a child, etc. And she responds, be it unto me according to thy word. There was a yes, there was a receiving. This is deep stuff. And Mary is not a passive figure. Her yes is the yes on which the whole of our incarnation, of the incarnation hangs, and our salvation with it. We're on deep territory here and beautiful territory. So male and female were the plan from the beginning. In our very bodies, we echo God's biggest plan of all, that he will come and live among us, born of a woman, living as a man. At the marriage of Cana, you have a very interesting dialogue between a man and a woman. It's intriguing. We don't know the name of the Jewish boy and girl who are getting married, but it's very significant that it's at a wedding. I didn't realize that. I remember when I was a child thinking, what a bore that he only turned water into wine. Didn't he turn some into lemonade for us? I had already, sneaked downstairs and tried to sip the remains of wine after my parents' dinner party or something and thought, how do they want to drink this stuff? So we don't know whether he did accommodate the little ones, but certainly the dialogue is very significant because we don't meet the bride and groom, we meet a man and a woman, Christ and his mother. Mary is what the church has often described as a type of the church. She represents the church. And this goes all the way back too into the Old Covenant and the great women of the Old Testament, of which we could say much more. But Mary is the instigator of Christ turning the water into wine. And he says something very interesting. He says to her, "My time has not yet come." His time, he always means his passion. And there's this dialogue between male and female, and it's at a wedding. And when his time has come, he will indeed turn not water into wine, but wine into his very flesh. So there's a whole nuptial message about the Eucharist in the wedding at Cana. And it goes on. On the cross, water and blood flow from his side, and he cries out that it is accomplished. It is consummated. Now, this is a very important thing for us to understand. It's deeper than we'd originally thought. It's much deeper than the idea, well, surely in an equal opportunities time, women can be priests. But you see, equal doesn't mean the same. And God is teaching us through our bodies. He brings new life into the world through human flesh. And even if you can do it in a test tube, he still requires something male to create life outside of himself. A male can do that. This is something that's very important for us to ponder, because instead of running away from a debate about male and female, we should understand the possibility that God is leading us forward to an authentic development in doctrine. Doctrine doesn't change, but we understand why about something. There have been examples of this in the history of the church where something has been challenged. I think I would go back to the Gnostics. It gave everybody a much richer understanding of why we have bodies and why it's important. You don't get this if you just say, I don't think you should discuss that, I don't think it's helpful, or I'll burn you at the stake if you discuss it. You have to get it by pondering the truth. It's in the experience of most of us that when somebody asks a question, they almost invariably ask it in a way that is slightly annoying or at a difficult time, as I said at the beginning of this talk. So saying, well, yes, but in answering this, I'm going to help the whole church to be enriched. You'll get them saying, shut up, I just want to be a priest, and you're not telling me. Do you see? You do have to see it in a much richer context. But in recent years, we've had very much this idea, why can't a woman be a priest? Isn't it simply a matter of equal opportunities? Christ chose only men. Now this is interesting, because in all the pagan religions of his day, except for the Jewish, the prefigurement of Christianity, and intimately and deeply and richly bound up with it, priesthood was always female. All the pagan religions had priestesses. That's what it was. A priestess was a woman. Priests were women. Christ was doing something unique. When he chose 12 men and called them, interesting, the original words always called, he called them. He didn't choose them for their very obvious attributes. I mean, it can be quite amusing to put it this way, but it is quite funny. I mean, one denied him, one doubted him, one betrayed him, and they all ran away at the end. Whereas women remained faithful, women ministered to his needs, and they were often the recipients of profound truths. Think of the woman at the well, who is interestingly depicted here, and for very good reasons. I, whom you are speaking to, I am he. What did she do? She put down her bucket of water and ran to tell everyone, which is one reason why you and I know about it. So she wasn't just meant to be drawing water. There's deep mystery here about the water which is necessary for life. And it seems possible that she was a woman not well thought of. She went in the heat of the day to the well, which was not the chosen time to do it. She went when nobody else was there. He always seemed to choose the unlikely. But she was not there just to be nobody, drawing her necessary bucket on her. No, she was chosen for something deep and important, to bring, if you like, the water of life to others. And that running to tell people, very deep. After the resurrection, the first person who sees Christ is a woman, Mary Magdalene. What does she do? She runs to tell the apostles. She runs to tell Peter and the others. Now, if she was a priest, she wouldn't need to do that. She is running, as the woman at the well ran, to tell. And she knew she had to tell Peter. Why? Why? What was the significance of that after that? Well, one could argue that Catholic women have been running to nag the priesthood into action ever since. And there is a very profound sense in which the woman sort of says, how lovely, do let's, come on, please let's. And yet they were not among the 12. It would have been absolutely natural for them to be so. Christ was doing something extremely unusual. Really extremely unusual in choosing 12 men. And he certainly didn't do it for their moral probity, although they end up as glorious martyrs and so on. But it's very, very significant. And he chooses the most interesting mixture. But every bit of the gospel is important. Fishermen, and I will make you fishers of men. We're in really interesting territory here. So when Christ was doing that and sending them forth and bringing them together at the Last Supper, bread and wine and so on, he was explaining something profound about male and female. Now we know that from the very earliest times there were women who followed the Lord and ministered to him and so on. We know quite a lot about them, and we know the names of some of the early martyrs. You'll hear them mentioned in the canon of the Mass: Agatha, Lucy, Anastasia, Cecilia, and we know that they were very strong. They were martyred, and right now women as well as men face martyrdom for their faith. It's very significant in the life of the Catholic Church. You've always got a lot of women and very strong women. And they're very interesting because they're a huge sort of mixture. And in many ways, they are showing things that would otherwise not be noticed about women. For example, a woman vowed to celibacy, to remaining single, and yet having a motherly role. I mean, the most obvious one in modern times is Mother, interesting choice of word, Mother Teresa of Calcutta. But what she did was very, very, very much opposed to what you would think would be an effective way to evangelize India. Extremely ineffective, because she ministers to the very poorest, who you wouldn't have thought were very influential, and yet she's been hugely, hugely influential in India, as I don't need to tell you, and was given, as you probably know, a state funeral, but hugely, hugely influential. Who were the great women saints? Well, huge numbers of them, but surely they were all, sort of dominated by men, no? It always intrigues me. People say, oh, women were just sort of doing what men told. Do you know the name of Teresa of Avila's parish priest? No, nor do I. You can probably check it out. Do you know her father's name? Mr. Avila, we may assume, but we don't know. We know a little bit about Bernadette Soubirous' parish priest because it's in the 19th century and it's well documented and so on, but he's really lost to us from history, although it's there. And you see him as a character as well, a decent enough old fellow. In the Song of Bernadette, plays a role. And her father, Mr. Soubirous, was probably a much-loved dad, but a hard-working bloke who was an out-of-work miller, getting work where he could. Do you see where I'm going with this? Women saints are important to God. But they weren't dominated by men or did what men told them. It's not like that at all. On the contrary, little Bernadette Soubirous was born into a time and a culture when a little girl who told fibs, I saw a lady in white in the cave, was not said, did you, darling? How lovely. She would have been walloped for telling lies or bragging. She had to be quite tough. I did see her, I did. And what the lady asked of her was tough stuff. She died in a convent, not very well treated there. The other nuns were jealous and it was difficult. And she didn't have the life she might have had, marrying a nice chap and having some nice noisy children, it's what she might legitimately have expected, a little peasant girl. And in the middle of the 19th century, in a rapidly changing Europe, she might have enjoyed, bringing a family to maturity and savouring some of the new things like railways and so on. No. She was asked to do something difficult and said, yes. And we may look at some of the great saints who've done other things. Some were called to public life. Think of some of the women of the Middle Ages who exercised very considerable power and influence. Elizabeth of Hungary. Do you know her husband's name? Ludwig, poor fellow. Died on the Crusades, as it happens. But she is much better known. There were great women who led lives of what one would have to describe as political influence. It's true they got there not by democratic elections, these had not been invented, But to this day, there is a calling for women in public life, and that's understood particularly by Christian women. And we've got examples of women in the modern era, particularly Catholic women, who could see that there was a need to do something in let's say, public life. This is important. And I can see some of this today, and we can look at some of the 19th century founders of religious orders, and we have some examples here in this very parish. Frances Taylor's cause for canonization has been put forward. No, you haven't heard of her? You will. She was a nurse with Florence Nightingale, and then came back to London, and in the extraordinarily difficult conditions of Soho in the mid-19th century, think hunger, dirt, disease, she founded a religious order that, among much else, has founded what we today would be called cooperatives for women, so that they could learn to do jobs like take in washing and run a budget and spread out the money they earned that they could raise their families on and get their kids educated. And one reason she did that was that one alternative, which was available to the women, was to earn money from the oldest profession of all, and she knew that was wrong. So in lifting women from degradation, she also achieved something splendid. Oh yes, God calls women to do great things. So we have male and female. We have a nuptial dialogue in the Mass. We have a nuptial dialogue at the Annunciation. The Incarnation didn't happen silently. It was a word spoken and received. There's something very important in that dialogue. There's something very important in our understanding of male and female. But it is true, I think, that the Church has not always fully, in modern times, understood this. I think she did in the past, but I think in the 19th and 20th centuries, she took a little while to understand the fullness of the role of women in the modern era. It's interesting, actually. In the modern era, it proved a little harder for women to become quite so very obviously preeminent. In an age of industry and rapidly changing industry, the role of woman, who was not going to do the heavy lifting and so on, literally, physically not able to do it, seemed to be less important. And in fact, there's quite a lot to explore to contrast the women of the Middle Ages with the women of the industrial era. However, the Church was always there, and I gave one example of a nun who founded a new religious order, and she wasn't the only one. In the north of England, Elizabeth Prout, you might hear of her name. She was another of these founders of great religious orders. And I may say the nuns who educated me, or made some attempt to do so when I wasn't larking around and doing... I loved school, but I always felt lessons got in the way of the real fun of things. But the nuns who educated me also founded schools across India, and founded, at the time, the first, and I think still the only, college for women in Karachi in newly independent Pakistan. So in the modern era, women have done great things, and I've already mentioned Mother Teresa of Calcutta and so on. But I do think in her official messages, the Church missed out a little bit, and I'm not criticizing the Church here. I'm just simply saying that I think the Church now is saying profoundly useful things, and I think slightly missed out earlier. It doesn't mean they taught the wrong thing. The teaching doesn't change. But there was an encyclical, Casti Connubii, in the 1920s, which spoke very well, about why contraception is all wrong. And it was actually in response to the Anglican Church's affirmation that you could use artificial means of contraception and so on. And it's quite good, but it talked about the role of women as mothers and as the most glorious and sacred role. But it was particularly sad, really, because it was published at a time when there were so many women who could never be mothers, because the men had been slaughtered. And it didn't really suggest you could deal with that. Somehow a word to the women who would have given anything to be a mother, but all they had was a faded sepia photograph of a lovely young man who'd perished on the Western Front or at Gallipoli. And not only in England, not only in Australia, not only in Canada, 1% of Canada's young men were killed at Vimy Ridge. That's an awful lot of young men. But of course, also in India, and what is today Pakistan, who nobly came to, and of course in Germany and Austria, all those lonely women. Not easy, and at that time, jobs available weren't very wide. You could become a librarian or a teacher, and you had to earn money, but not very much at that point, because your brother had probably also been slaughtered, and you had to look after your elderly parents. Somehow the Church didn't quite speak to that. Now, I'm not having a tirade against the church. I'm just balancing the profound truths of our glorious faith. Does this make sense? With an occasional lack of, a tin ear? Then you get, not a lack of tin ear, I mean a lack of sound and a tin ear. Then you get the times when the church raises up great saints who speak exactly to the now. And John Paul II is a really interesting example. Read, ladies in particular, if you haven't read his beautiful Mulieris Dignitatem, read it. Read his letter to women. He really understood the role of women as different from men. And he used this expression which the press misunderstood, of the genius of women. It doesn't mean we're all incredibly brainy, although obviously some of us are blessed with the most amazing, no. We've all met, and I am one, some women who can be extremely silly at times. But he did understand that there is something about woman and something about man, and he happened to be writing to women. He also understood the beauty of marriage. And the church, again, had tended to assume we all knew that it was beautiful, and instead to start explaining why contraception or adultery was wrong. Do you see what I mean? It was a given that marriages are good. Not now. Nothing's a given. You have to say that it's good. And I think we needed all that. We are living in a time when there have been some very remarkable women, Catholic women, in your lifetime and mine. I mentioned Mother Teresa. Think about Chiara Lubich, who founded the Focolare movement. Think about Mother Angelica, tough cookie that one, who founded the Eternal Word television network. I don't think these were necessarily deeply connected with John Paul's Mulieris Dignitatem, but it's interesting that in the providence of God, we have actually some very interesting examples of women. We also have examples of married people, where marriage itself needs to be emphasized. So, the understanding of male and female, we may not want to be living in the now and having to discuss it, but we should. We need to affirm marriage. It is a sacrament. It is sacred. It is how new life comes into the world. It is a giving and a receiving. It's the ultimate domestic church. It's not easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was. It includes sacrifice. It includes a mutual making holy. That is the idea. And it takes us back to the beginning. In the order of marriage, there's a marvelous expression which I loved when I first heard it, that marriage is the one blessing not destroyed by original sin or washed away in the flood. I have a particular resonance of this because when Jamie and I got married, which was about 100 years ago, we used things in those days called typewriters. You won't know about them, but anyway. And one way of getting your little order of service printed was to print it out, type it out on a nice electric typewriter, which you tended not to have at home, was sort of an office thing, and then take it already done like that to a print shop and get it done. So Jamie and I sat in the bowels of the House of Commons, where I was at the time working, and typed out the whole of our order of service, with one dictating for the other and taking, turn and turn about. So I remember, the one blessing, comma, not destroyed by original sin. Should that be a capital O? Do you know, like that? So we went through it one way or another several times, all the phrases, some of which were very familiar to us, and it was this one that really resonated with me. The one blessing, not destroyed by original sin or lost or washed away in the flood. And it's a strange thing because many years later, I've always loved this, and it became something that we said to one another in a slightly jokey sort of way, because marriage is like that. And many years later, a dear friend of mine in Australia, but she was a dear friend, but we'd only known each other by letter and so on, and she and her new husband came to Britain. And we'd become friends by letter, but I hadn't met her before. And in our correspondence, we had mentioned the areas of our lives that were of interest. She's a real theologian. Her name's Tracy Rowland. She's become quite a well-known theologian now in Rome and so on. Anyway, we met them at a tube station, and I said something about congratulations, on your marriage or whatever. And she said, oh, yeah, it's so important. There's a wonderful bit in the marriage service that says marriage is, and I finished it for her, and we chorused it together. We were standing in Hyde Park at the time. We'd just crossed over from the tube. The one blessing not destroyed by original sin or washed away in the flood. And I've always thought wasn't that marvelous? And she's a real grown-up theologian now. So there is something profound about it. The other thing is that it takes you back to the beginning, the original plan. This, again, I must just add a silly personal note here. This is a joke between Jamie and me. Before we all had mobile phones, it was sometimes difficult when you made an appointment to do something and couldn't make it. You often had to leave a note on the shop window or something, saying, "See you at the next bus stop," or something. Do you see what I mean? And you sometimes left a message. Would you, if you see this chap coming in and asking, I know it sounds silly, but it was actually difficult. Remember? No, of course you don't remember, but it was confusing. Jamie and I had a saying that we agreed that if there was ever any confusion, we would always stick to the original plan. In other words, if you said you would meet at Victoria, you would still try to get back to Victoria. Do you see what I mean? Rather than try to leave a note saying, actually, it would turn out to be more easy if you met me at St. Patrick's. Stick to the original plan. And somewhere in that was that feeling that marriage is the original plan. I know it's a joke, but marriage life, well, you have to make a laugh of it, otherwise it's quite unbearable. But there is something very precious in this. So, we need to understand that male and female were God's plan. We need to understand that the church follows this plan. We need to understand that it's a nuptial plan. And we need to understand that this is a plan we may not fully have understood, and the church is richly learning new things. Why can't a woman be a priest? Christ called only men, an unusual thing to do. Christ understood his role as the bridegroom. He always refers to the bridegroom. He spoke of the church as his bride. There is something nuptial in this. Women have always been important in the church. Women who could have been called to be priests, most significantly, were not. The culture of the day demanded priestesses. That was standard. Our understanding of male and female is richly connected with the original covenant plan that goes back to the Old Covenant and its Jewish roots. The idea that we can now say we got all of that wrong is to me not really feasible. It's one thing for the church to say the right thing but in the not useful way, and I gave you an example of that. It's one thing for the church perhaps, and I'm speaking of the church in her official sense, not to respond in quite the way you would like to some sort of urgency. I can remember saying years before we got the new catechism of the Catholic Church, why don't they produce a solid book with something I can use? And then she did. Mother Church. But the understanding that God ignored the church for 2 millennia and made a mistake is something that I cannot see could ever stand up to any evidence. It doesn't work in the nuptial understanding. Our bodies are not an extra. We are not encumbered by them. God loves your body. It is beautiful to him. He made us in the image of God, and then he became a man. He became a human being of the male sex. When we think about priesthood, it is not about a feeling. It's an invitation from Mother Church to share in her work. And it's an understanding that it goes all the way back to the beginning, to the nuptial bond of Christ and his church, and prefigured by the bond of God to the people of Israel. We've always known that we have a male priesthood, but as John Henry Newman observed, we sometimes need to understand more about why. That is development of doctrine. It cannot change, but it can be enriched, nourished. The atmosphere around any discussion at the moment is poisonous. Angry lobbyists are ready to pounce if you even say that men and women are different. And the idea that you can trans from one to the other is now so deeply entrenched that you can be sacked, hounded out of your job if you say that that is not the case. But our bodies are real. And you can't think yourself into growing another leg if one of yours has to be amputated. The human body is not only sacred, but intricate and interesting. And we're actually discovering more and more about how different we are, including the bit of our bodies not very well explored until now, the brain. And there are a lot of things that are interesting. And on this note, I'm going to end because I think it fascinates me that we're more different than we thought. Little girls learn to talk before boys. And they talk more throughout their childhood. And one could say beyond, but anyway. You will find far more boys than girls in all remedial reading classes, despite the fact that they tend to have books that might be more appealing to boys. That was always what was said. They now have everything is more appealing to girls, and if there's ever a picture of a little girl, she's always in dungarees or something, showing how sort of ho-ho she is. So you can't have anything that is girly or boyish, if you see what I mean. You have to have girls in dungarees. I think this actually irritates both. But the point I'm getting at is that boys have struggled to learn to read. Girls read more throughout their childhood, and then they all catch up later on in their teens. I find this fascinating. Did you know, too, that until the late 19th century, it was quite difficult to persuade some families to have their boys educated at all? He doesn't need any book learning. He's 8 years old now, ought to be earning money. The Catholic Church pioneered teaching little boys. And the college they chose to educate men to become teachers, and they became extremely good teachers, is St. Mary's Catholic University at Twickenham. I had the privilege of being asked to write their history. I've been the visiting research fellow there, and I was fascinated. They wanted boys to get the chance to go to school. And that college was founded 2 decades before compulsory education, 3 decades before compulsory education came into Britain. It was originally to train men to teach little boys, to try to persuade working class parents that it wasn't dangerous for their little boy to learn to read and write because they thought it was girly. Women live longer than men, a mixed blessing, but still. And we are in many ways advantaged. We have fewer sort of female-specific diseases. And of course, historically, we have been incredibly blessed. If the fields of Flanders and of Gallipoli were lined row after row of teenage girls, you'd be appalled, but it's boys. Ever been to a graveyard from the First World War? They are all boys. There aren't any girls. Of course, women suffered. They suffered terribly in war, as I've indicated, partly by not having anyone to marry and give them children. But next time somebody says women have always been the victims, really? Sure about that? How many women were slaughtered by machine gun fire in 1418? Now, women suffer in lots of other ways. Women do die, and childbearing has often been difficult, although it's not a disease, and one of the things that the church understands is that it is beautiful and so on. But our medical knowledge, the arrival of disinfectants and so on, meant that we pretty well eliminated puerperal fever. Could usefully have come earlier, of course, that. But who is the more favoured sex? I don't think either is. Each has its own sorrows, its own hardships, its own difficulties. Whatever problems there are for men, there are also problems for women and vice versa. It's a fallacy of the modern era that everything has to consist of a victim and an oppressor. Some things do, but when it comes to the two sexes, it's different. As we are growing up, one of the things that's really important is to understand who we are and how much we are loved by God. The New Testament shows the example of women who knew how much they were loved by God and who responded to that love. They were able to do so because they grasped sometimes things that men found harder to grasp. They were more open to receiving the word. And for example, the idea of forgiveness, a woman pouring the oil over Christ's feet, is all very, very beautiful, isn't it? On the other hand, you have Peter, poor, bluntly speaking, complicated Peter, who after he denies the Lord goes out and weeps bitterly. So there's male and female. Both are important in God's plan. Will we have bodies in heaven? Yes, I believe in the resurrection of the body, we say every time we recite the creed. Mary was bodily into heaven. She precedes us. She is there with his body, and Christ is there. He is male. She is female. You are loved by God. He loves you as you are. If you are a lady, if you are a woman, if you are a girl, These are the words we use that are beautiful. He loves you. He delights in your beauty. If you are a man, he delights in you. He had a body just like yours. God loves us. Love, Bishop Robert Barron said, isn't something God does, it's something he is. His love is bigger than we can imagine. But in order to show it, he became one of us as a man and died and rose again. These are great truths, and they're spousal truths, truths about marriage. Male and female, he created them. That's the story.